Hello there, Randy. Nice to see you tonight. Yeah, wonderful to see you. It's my evening, it's your morning. We have a whole show about talking about storytelling, narrative, and the ABT. So I'm very, very happy to be here. And I
Cool.
would
Who's your guest? That sounds exciting.
yeah, who knows about those things?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't wait to hear somebody that's really knowledgeable talk about it.
Yeah. So maybe to give a tiny bit of background about how I came across you. So I've been interested in incorporating storytelling into my own writing and videos and those things, but I was always struggling with whatever I looked at for storytelling just seemed vague and esoteric and abstract. And when I stumbled across the ABT, which is the framework you developed, for the first time I had the sense of like, oh, this is really something I can get behind. So I kind of dove into the deep end, and that's why I'm talking to you here. So to maybe start off, I would love to know, you developed the ABT. What is the ABT? What's the ABT framework, and what is it there for?
Now, what's the point of what you're asking?
So
No. Sorry, I'm going to cut you off. That's what
okay.
that's what the ABT is for. There you go, right there. The ABT is the tool that helps you understand what your point is, and I think that's in a lot of ways the single most challenging aspect of communication. And you're constantly hearing people either cutting the other person off or just thinking to themselves, what's this person's point? What are they getting at? Why are they rambling here and there? And in fact, with so many people that are working on important projects, things like that, it's so crucial that they've got that ability to instantly say, look, here's my point. This is what I'm doing. This is what this is all about. And as a matter of fact, one of the historians that we work with, Patricia Limerick at University of Colorado, is a big fan of the ABT, and she began using it with PhD students. And one of the things she reported back was that these poor students try and do their dissertation on some topic in history, and they bite off, the entire American progressive era, which is gargantuan in complexity. And then they have to meet with a committee of professors and explain what they're studying. And they just say, what's the main thing you're doing? And the next thing you know, they're going all over the place. Well, I'm into, I'm studying on this, and it's also about this, and about this. It's all interesting to the person doing it. But it results in them being terrified in these meetings because they come in there and they're, I'm not sure how I'm going to present all this stuff that I'm working on. It's all so cool. And if they had 12 hours, we could go through everything, but we only have an hour in this meeting. And she said, as she began to introduce it and get the students to use the ABT, they began going in and doing much better in these thesis committee conferences. And they began to develop more self-confidence, because they would go in not terrified, like, oh my God, I hope they don't ask me about this, this, and this. They would go in saying, if all falls apart, and they say, what exactly are you working on? I'm working on, people have been doing this and this, but the one thing nobody's ever really studied is this. Therefore, what I'm studying is this. It's just more than anything else, a tool for focusing, which in a world of too much information is endlessly challenging. And so that's the core element of it.
So let me maybe jump in there because I really think a few of the points you've mentioned is interesting. And I think for some people listening to this, they're still asking themselves, what are they talking about? So
what's the point? What's the point of all this?
So the ABT framework is a framework for writing / for organizing your thoughts,
okay, let me get more specific about what the ABT is. So
yes.
Now that we've mystified people, hopefully we've aroused
It's always
some
a good
interest. Now it's
start.
time to fulfill. Yes, exactly. The ABT stands for 3 letters: and, but, therefore. And at its core, it's extremely simple. And simplicity is the essential resource for effective communication, for clarity. And if you can't get a grasp on simplicity, you'll never get people to really understand you. You just can't. And it used to be a little easier to communicate 30, 40, 50 years ago when there wasn't so much information in the world. But today, we're awash in too much information. And so this is a tool that is really pre-adapted to today's world of too much information. And it's the idea of boiling down everything you have to say into a single sentence, ideally, which is the ABT sentence, using these 3 words: and, but, therefore. And so for someone doing a research project in doing a dissertation in history, it would boil their whole thing down to the American Civil War took place in the 1860s, and it was a horrible conflict. But the one aspect of it that people have never really understood is this. Therefore, my work is looking at that one thing that nobody's ever really understood. And you can see it goes over and over again. Communication, to be effective, needs to go from the general to the specific. This is one of the patterns that Matt, my co-instructor, and I, who we talk every single day practically for the past 3 to 4 years, we've slowly come to realize, constantly going from the general to the specific. When you walk up to a friend on the street, you start off really general. Oh, hey, how are you today? What's going on? You know, all this vague stuff that doesn't have much meaning. And then you get to the specific. And I heard that you're moving, you know, or whatever it is. You go from the general to the specific over and over again as a general principle in communication. And that's how you get people to understand what you want to talk about, is you begin with the general. And sure, you can begin with the specific. You know, you can say, yesterday, my carport collapsed on my car. And that'll wake people up. But it won't be as effective for communication in the long term as if you're able to go from the general to the specific. If you're able to give us the world you live in. You know, I live in this nice house, and I got this carport, and I got this really nice car, and it sits there. But yesterday, the carport collapsed on it and destroyed it. Therefore, I'm now suing the builders who built that carport. And this is the fundamental divide between journalism and, I guess we should call it storytelling. I mean, this stuff turns into all these semantics where people have not bothered to define words, and so there's lots of confusion. But let me tell you one little anecdote that brings this to life. A few months ago, in teaching our course to one group, one organization, their communications director was present, and she has a background in journalism. And when it was all done, she came up to me and she said, oh, your ABT, I see it's just like the inverted pyramid that we use in journalism. And I had never really completely thought it through, but my first response was, I don't think that's quite right. And then I went home that evening and set to work. And you know what I did? I went to ChatGPT and I asked it, tell me the difference between the inverted pyramid structure of journalism versus 3-act structure of drama, theatrics, storytelling, yada, yada, yada. And it gave a perfect answer. And the next session of the course, I began by presenting what ChatGPT said about that. And it described in very clear terms what the inverted pyramid is. It's what journalists use. And it's a structure that you use to grab eyeballs, because that's what journalists are about. They're not about changing hearts and minds. They're about grabbing eyeballs and getting people to buy their newspaper or whatever and hold their attention and feed them some information. And ideally, if they do a good job, they're telling you a little bit of the bigger picture. But number one, they're grabbing eyeballs. That's their number one mission for 98% of journalists. Storytellers, meaning people crafting novels or epic stories or movies or who knows what, they're ideally looking to go inside and grab your brain, and also your heart and everything else. But that's the fundamental divide. And storytelling involves 3-act structure, where the big punch doesn't come up front. It comes at the end of your setup. So you bring us in, you give us a setup, you get us oriented, you don't challenge us much at all. And then you give us the gut punch of, we just found a dead body. And then you take us off on a journey. Now, you can make a movie that opens with the dead body, but people aren't going to retain it as deeply and as long as if you've taken the time to set things up diligently. And that's the challenge in today's world. And that's what's going extinct in today's world. And now here we are jumping ahead to what you mentioned to me before we started here, that you're interested eventually in talking about narrative selection. But that's what's going on in today's world, is that this world of too much, the environment has changed. And if you have ever studied evolutionary biology, which is what I did my PhD in back in the science days, you know that when environments change, species change. they get selected for and against. And that's what's happened to us as a culture, is we've changed our environment drastically. Why in the world there isn't more widespread discussion and attempts to understand this dynamic is very sad, I think. But it's really what politicians should have little teams or assistants working on, trying to figure out, in this world that keeps changing, how do we stay ahead of it? How do we keep changing to keep up with it? Because that's what we're in, this cultural evolution race that is going at breakneck speed as we change our communication dynamics. And it's just, we don't communicate very well now, because we've created, the science and technology world have created this intense environment of rapid communication. And look at where we've gone from a society that communicated 150 years ago only through newspapers. That was kind of the main broad communication. Then eventually radio, then television. And by the 1960s, Marshall McLuhan, the great media scholar from Canada, identified the idea that the medium is the message. And he talked about, we are a media-driven society. And that was kind of the beginning of realizing, he, I think more than anybody else, realized that television is this strange form of communication that is very non-literal. And it's not like writing. Books and newspapers are one form of communication. Going into visual media changes everything. And you kind of need to go to film school or make a bunch of films to really begin to grasp that. Because if you look at what my journey has been, I was an academic till age 38. I was a professor, studied science, and wrote all my little papers. And I lived and breathed in the written world, in this very literal, science-based written world. And everything added up very rationally. And then I began making films. And what goes on with making films is this transition from the written to the visual world. So you write a script, and then eventually what you've written on that script ends up on a screen. And you really can't 100% predict exactly how that's going to look on a screen and how it's going to impact people, what's going to go on. And I'll give you, am I doing okay? Am I rambling too much here? Are we staying on
I
course?
think we have about 15 different pots open, and I would love, actually, I would love to return to the change of the medium in a moment.
Yeah.
If possible, I would like to backtrack about 5 steps back to the ABT.
Can I give you one little story to finish that thread?
Give me one story, then I'll backtrack.
Yeah, okay, about this transition from written to visual, because I think that's at the core of what we're talking about here. It's so important. So the year before I entered film school at the University of Southern California, there was a very bright graduate student there who made one of every semester they picked 4 students to make their big film, and everybody else had to serve as crew on it. And so this guy, who I think was German, by the way, made a film, and it was called 12. And a simple little story of kind of white trash guy who had this white trash girlfriend, and she had a 12-year-old daughter. And he comes over to see her, and he's bought a red sexy dress for the 12-year-old daughter. And the 12-year-old daughter's kind of got a thing for him, and she's all excited. And then the mother leaves the 2 of them at home because she has to go into town and get something. And the 12-year-old daughter puts on the red dress and starts, kind of modeling it for him. And eventually they end up on the couch kissing. So this is long before the whole society gone insane over pedophilia. It was really when it was kind of, things were starting to get pretty intense about that. So he wrote that script, and he was a powerful writer, and it got chosen by the big committee there as one of the 4 films out of 50 students that submit their scripts. And then they went and they had weeks of developing the script. Everybody read the script. Everybody read in writing that these scenes were going to happen. There's going to be a scene eventually where this 35-year-old guy is kissing this 12-year-old girl, and the guy explained, when we shoot it, they won't even be touching, its camera angles will cheat it, and the mother of the girl will even be there, yada yada. And they did all that stuff, so there wasn't anything ever really happened in the filming. But the day they showed the footage in the class, a bunch of women started screaming, and a group of them jumped up and ran and called the police, and the police showed up on campus and confiscated the film. None of which has anything to do with the gender politics, any of that sort of stuff. It has to do with the idea that nobody could project what they would be seeing visually from the written script. They all read it in the script, but it wasn't until it was shot and up on the screen that it horrified everybody. Like, oh my God, that was what you described. And then the whole thing melted down at that point. So the point of that whole story is this leap from written to media. And this is what we've done. And so we've turned ourselves into a media-driven society. And now in the last 20 years, we've turned ourselves into a social media-driven society. And so that's my main point, is that the environment has changed so rapidly. Our brains haven't changed at all. And people are just, there's a huge time lag now trying to figure out where this is all going, all of which leads back to the need for a short, small, simple, punchy tool for dealing with narrative structure, because that's our only hope, is to continue to maintain the ability to tell things that have got narrative structure to them. So there you go.
So let's try and put some
make some sense out of it.
Some scaffolding on what's going on here. So number one, I would love to take a second with that story, because that's actually pretty profound.
Isn't it? It just blows my mind.
The fact that everybody read the script, but that nobody could predict how they would react to it.
That's it.
This would kind of be the question of, what if Lolita hadn't been a book but a movie?
There you go. There you go. And an explicit movie as well. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And it was a movie eventually, but it wasn't shot that explicitly. But even then, it stirred all kinds of controversy. And I'm sure there were some critical comments made about the script when it was done, but nobody called the police over the script. It was the day they showed the footage that flipped it, and that's it. And I mean, over and over again, this is what we see with God right now. God, let's not get into what's going on in the Middle East, but it's pretty monumental, the amount of distortion, misinformation happening on Twitter right now from the Middle East thing. Is that, and this is all super relevant, because what Elon Musk has gone and done with Twitter is he's removed all of the censors. They had these people that were sitting there censoring the footage as it comes in, and now he's decided to crowdsource it, I guess, because what you see for the last couple of days, I looked at the Feed Israel attack or something like that a couple of days ago, and you started to see all these instances of people that are taking footage from 2 years ago from other incidents and giving it their own label to it, and there was, first thing I saw was this shot of all of these paragliders landing, hundreds of them. Well, that was a shot from Egypt eventually. But if you watched it the first 2 or 3 times, it came up like, oh my God, look at that. And then finally it had something, there's a statement, I need to memorize what it is, but it says basically, users have added context that this is fake footage that came from Egypt. Why put it up there with this warning label at the bottom when it's deception, when it's misinformation? But the key point is that the key word in so much of this stuff is context. And this is where it gets back to the ABT being so powerful and important, because it helps you boil down the 3 fundamental forces of communication, which are setup, problem, solution, or we can call it agreement, contradiction, consequence, or we can call it context, contradiction, and consequence.
So how does the ABT, how does the 3-act structure, how does that relate to the different media formats? How does the ABT tie those together?
So let's take a look at what the ABT is. It's 3 elements: and, but, and therefore. But those are only the 3 words. They're the manifestation. What it captures are the 3 forces. That's what you really want to know about. And that's the pathway to effective communication. And that's the pathway to narrative intuition, is to develop a feel for these 3 forces. And the first force is agreement. As I was saying, this is the best way to communicate, is you begin with what we can agree on. And every great movie, every great novel, pretty much, they all begin with this effort that's invested to set things up. That's what the first part is. You set things up. You set up all this information that you're going to do something with eventually. So we have the whole setup. That's the first part. Then the second part is the beginning of the narrative process, and it begins in a single moment, ideally, with the word "but." And so there's your story. You know, we're in a small town and everybody's happy and they're going about their way, and we get to know this family, and there's mother and father and kids, yada, yada, yada. That's all set up. That's all the first element. That's all and stuff. And if we go on too long with that stuff, it starts to stall out and get boring. Like, okay, we got it. Everybody's happy in this town. Why are we here in this town? Then you start the story with the word but somebody walks in the backyard and there's the father lying dead. That activates everybody's brain in a big way. We've taken to calling that the butt bomb. That's what you'll see in the last two versions of our narrative gym book. We refer to that as you drop your butt bomb, and that lights up the brain. Now we have a problem, and now we begin the narrative process. We set off on a journey trying to find the solution to that problem. Problem is, we got a dead father. The solution is who killed him and what we're going to do about that. That is the whole middle part of a good story, is the journey. And I define in my Houston We Have a Narrative book the word narrative as the series of events that occur in the search for the solution to a problem. That's a 15-word definition, and it's really worth memorizing, because people throw this word narrative around everywhere nowadays. Nobody is defined it analytically. You talk to humanities people and they say, we can't, story versus a narrative, it's the same thing. A story is a narrative, a narrative is a story. No, it's not the same thing. Narrative structure is what's at the core of a good story. And narrative structure is this 15-word definition, if you ask me. The series of events that occur in the search for the solution to a problem. And so Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, identified this a century ago, but he identified it in a little bit more complicated model called the monomyth. The ABT brings it down to very simple dynamics, this three-part structure, this tripartite structure. And so setup, then we have our problem, and then we take off on the narrative part of the story, the journey, to try and solve it. And then when you finally solve it, when you find who the murderer is, then your audience will give you a little bit of time that you've earned at the end there to return to being more analytical and more intellectual, and talk about what you learned in this whole journey. And that's the basic circular pattern of a story. And essential to it, for it to work really effectively, is structure. Now, there's all kinds of more artistic variations on that where you don't have as much structure, and you can even have artsy films that have no structure at all. And those are nice, but they just don't reach the large audience. It's the power of story is when it gets closer and closer to that ideal form, classical design, as Robert McKee calls it.
So that's the power of the story. Why should somebody like a scientist, somebody like a business communicator, why should they care about story? Why should they care about?
Because we are problem solution animals. And it's a nice little book 13 years ago by Jonathan Gottschalk called Storytelling Animal, but he didn't quite get to the core of it with that book. It's not that we're storytelling animals, it's that we're problem solution creatures, and that every creature is a problem solution creature, and that every lizard that walks out of its burrow every morning starts the day confronting the world with a problem. How am I going to feed? How am I going to mate? How am I going to find shelter? All of these problems, and spends the whole day trying to solve them, searching for food. Problem solution. Your dog or cat or whatever, they're every day they've got this problem solution dynamic. And so why wouldn't the brain be molded around the simple problem solution dynamic? That's the main thing that we do day in and day out. Yeah, if you're lucky enough, you can spend some time doing some art and making some paintings and things like that aren't maybe quite as problem solution oriented. But at the primal level, it's all just problem solution dynamics. And then you start to look at that and you realize that just breaks into three parts. There's the setup, which is I've gotten hungry because my stomach's empty. There is the problem. my stomach's empty, I got to get some food. And then there's the solution, the 3-part structure there. And so that's what all of this stuff, this universality, that's why the ABT is so powerful. And, stay tuned. We're reaching bigger and broader demographics very quickly. And so we've got this series of books that we've written now, applying it to 5 different disciplines now. So business, law, politics, science, and medicine. Each one of those professions, the ABT is just central. It's just central to everything we do. Hey, cues the title of a book I wrote called Narrative is Everything. And I wrote this in response to a schmuck-headed climate scientist who once upon a time on a conference call, as I was trying to explain the ABT dynamics of something, interrupted and said, "Oh, Randy, you think that the ABT is a hammer and everything's a nail." And the more I thought that through, the more I realized he's right. The ABT is a hammer. Everything is a nail. Everything we do, the whole culture, everything's all this narrative structure, this setup, problem, solution. Everybody plays games. Everybody does crossword puzzles. Everybody sits there day in, day out playing sports. It's all problem solution dynamics. That's what the brain does. It solves problems day in and day out. So why wouldn't our communication dynamics be structured around that? That's the simple core of everything that we're talking about.
Well, maybe another answer could be, well, no, you're right. Problem solution or narrative isn't everything. It's just everything we humans do with our brain. Yeah, it might even be more.
That's a little bit figurative, that title, Narrative is Everything, but
yeah.
It is. There's a narrative dynamic going on with pretty much everything. And so, yeah, you're building a house. You got to set up problem solution right there. Anything you're doing.
So basically the ABT is a framework. Is these a framework coming up with what's your and statement, the statement of agreement? This is the setup. What's your but statement? What's the problem that comes in? And what's your therefore statement? Meaning, how do you solve that problem? And that ABT framework can be used, if we go back to the example of the historian, she can use that ABT structure once she's figured it out for her thesis. She can use it in the meetings with people asking her, so what are you writing about? What's your point? But she can also use it actually in her writing process, because the more clearly she's defined her narrative, she can figure out what's actually important for this thesis I'm writing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the power of it, precisely. The only problem is that she's going to have to invest a lot of time to get it really clear so that she doesn't fumble things and drop the ball. But if she can do that, then she'll get the payoff. That's the challenge that we face now in a world with too much information, everybody running too fast. And one of the manifestations, one of the sad manifestations, was what happened in 2016. The entire Democratic Party in the United States got behind a candidate who had zero narrative dynamics to what she was doing. She had no message, and it was very sad to watch. And what's mind-boggling is that she'd written a book called It Takes a Village, where she developed some story and narrative to her life's mission earlier, and yet the people that she ended up surrounding herself with in her campaign were devoid of narrative intuition. And how in the world you run a candidate that doesn't have a message? That verbatim is what happened that year. And it came up in so many articles, people saying that this campaign has no message. And in fact, she was asked on Meet the Press by Chuck Todd, who said, what's the one thing at the core of your whole campaign? And she scoffed and said, there's no one thing. We're about this, we're about that. We don't want to trivialize our thing by bringing down the one thing or a campaign. It's not trivializing, it's the way the world works. And she lost to a guy who has incredibly powerful narrative intuition and still does, and still is a major factor. And everybody ought to look more analytically at what he has for capability, because where did the guy come from? He came out of television, straight out of Marshall McLuhan's world. His brain was pre-adapted to American society. He knew, he came out of the gates with a singular, simple message: make America great again. And he was ridiculed in the beginning for that message. And then through narrative selection, guess what? It started getting selected for. The masses who all voted for him began to retain that. That is how the brain is structured to try and find this out. And you got to understand that the academics and the intellectuals are just this tiny little slice of the population. They aren't the main dynamic. And so they lock on, and yet they spend a lot of the time filling the airways with their discussions. And the vast majority of them just assume that the whole public thinks and processes information the same way that they do when they don't. There's such a fundamental divide that goes on now. And it could be, the ending characteristic of this whole American society, because it's just gotten more defined and refined and polarized with the advent of social media and the internet. But in the new book, which, by the way, here it is, the proof of the new book, the happiest news I've gotten in a long, long time. I've written 11 books, and we would hope that each one gets better, and at least this one does. This is really better than all the rest of them. It's the state of the art where we are now. And it's a series that we've done of these 6 books called The Narrative Gym. And now they're all a bunch of them like this, different colors. Oops, there's 2 red ones. And they are the message all put together. And so this new one, the 6 books, as I said, are law and politics and yada, yada. But the new one is for medicine. And I've got 3 doctors that help me in different parts of it. And it boils it down more than ever before and kind of makes it clear that we are this media-driven society. And the new book begins with a little anecdote about 1975. There was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine titled Obfuscation, Medical Obfuscation, Structure and Function. And the author talked about in 1975, he said that he took 3 articles from the New England Journal of Medicine and looked at the way in which they were communicated and pointed out 10 characteristics that all lead to obfuscation, meaning taking something that could be understood and explaining it in such a convoluted and upside down manner that only these convoluted upside down academic brains can really follow. The discussion of it was very short, but really powerful and brief. And one of the main things he said in the discussion was that 100 years ago, we didn't communicate like this. 100 years ago, everybody communicated better than today, especially physicians. Doctors didn't used to speak in this weird language of obfuscation that they do today. And he warned that so much knowledge that was being produced from the biomedical world was being lost because it's unreadable in these papers and the presentations, things like that given. That article was never got much traction, but the sad irony is that the author of that article was Michael Crichton, who went on to write Jurassic Park and made hundreds of millions of dollars in Hollywood and all these best-selling novels and Westworld and ER and all of these great shows. And he was bilingual. He had been a doctor. He went to Harvard Medical School and then did a residency at Mass General, ended up as a postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute in La Jolla. And that's where he wrote that short paper, is his final goodbye to the science world. That was the last thing he published in the scientific literature. And he knew better than anybody else that we had become this media-driven society. He basically was right there with Marshall McLuhan saying, look at what's happening here. We're communicating differently. We're communicating poorly, and we're not keeping up with the change in this information environment. And so here we are almost 50 years later, and he died in 2008, but he exited totally frustrated with the science world over many things, but including communication. And that's where we are now. And that's what we saw with the pandemic the last 3 years. It was just this morass of misinformation exceeding the amount of information at times. And it's just.
So with this, in this new environment, what's the job facing people who want to communicate better? And how do your courses, how does your training around the ABT, around narrative intuition, how does that play into that?
First off, it's not clear that we can fix this. I don't know. What's happened is that technology has changed so rapidly, and just it's a Frankenstein story. You know, the science and technology community have produced stuff, including AI, that, you know, is the next nightmare being unleashed that everybody's already probably lost control of. So there's no guarantees we can fix anything. But the only thing I can guarantee is that the ABT structure is more effective for people than the polar opposite, which is non-narrative. So let me say just a couple orienting words on that if anybody's lost about this at this point. So there's two basic forms. It's more or less a spectrum. At one end is the non-narrative form, where you just get up there and you just spew out facts and information, and you throw out, you know, a whole bunch of things. Here's all the stuff that we've studied and all we've learned. And you let the audience piece it together and make a story out of themselves. And you run the risk of them getting completely lost and coming up with the wrong conclusions of what you were talking about. You just haven't made an argument at all. This is what happens in so many court cases. You know, you get one lawyer that's really bad with narrative and is just up there throwing out, what about this? What about that? Blah, 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 blah. And then you got another one that knows how to argue really clearly in a defined way. Well, that clear argument is ABT structure. And so that's pure narrative. So one end of the spectrum, we have pure narrative that the brain is programmed to receive, you know, give us what's the setup problem solution. And the other end, we have non-narrative and structure. And as I began to identify that in 2013, I did a TED Med talk that a lot of people connected with, and people came up to me after that talk at this conference and said, I've never realized all these years I've been giving and presentations, I didn't know there was anything wrong with it. And I would say there's nothing wrong with it. It's just massively suboptimal. Most of the people just aren't following you, and you're welcome to go ahead and just and the world for the rest of the time. But people just aren't going to pick up on it. The material, the knowledge and information that we have that persists over time tends to be tightly ABT structured. So that's what we need: setup, problem, solution. So that's what the tool is meant for. And then what was your question? I felt the need to go back and define this divide.
So what's the media landscape has changed.
Yeah.
And it's changing very rapidly still.
Yeah.
What good can the ABT?
Okay, let me tell you. Okay, let me tell you now the number one large scale change of what you've just talked about there, which is the first act is going extinct. And someone eventually, hopefully, will ask me to write an editorial on this, because this is my core message right now, is the first act is going extinct. We are, here's an anecdote to match up with that just popped in my mind. 2010, I had just come out with my first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, and we did a thing at the Book Expo in New York City with the publishers, and then they had a panel discussion. They had a whole bunch of them, and one of them, they had 3 editors of big-time best-selling novels, and at the end of the discussion, the moderator said, what's the one prediction you can give us for the future? And one of the guys said, in the future, your novels, the dead body is not going to show up on page 50. It's going to show up on page 5 or sooner. That was it. You know, I'd like to go back and find that discussion and quote that person verbatim. That's exactly what's happening now. Look at the movies, look at documentaries. The dead body is showing up at the beginning now. Everybody's lost their patience and their ability to set up anything. And that gets paralleled with what you're seeing on Twitter. And that gets parallel with what you saw 2 days ago now, is this crowdsourcing of people saying, here's the context, because Twitter selects against narrative structure. There's not enough space in Twitter to do a good job with the 3 elements. There's not enough space. And so there's an appendix in my Houston We Have a Narrative book in 2015 where I talked about this, which was that Twitter in the beginning was way too short, 140 characters. And we began to count the number of characters in ABTs when people write them without much guidance, and they average about 300 characters. So what that means is if you want to do a good, responsible job of making a short message on Twitter and including the context, meaning the whole setup, where this, the orientation, the problem, and the solution, you need 300 characters around there. And they originally had 140 characters. I mean, the story of this is fascinating. Where'd that 140 characters come from? Came from SMS. Where'd that come from? Literally, it came from a guy in the 1980s who looked at postcards and counted the number of characters in sentences on a postcard and decided that that's looks like as much as you need to tell a good sentence. There wasn't any international committee that studied the length of tweet. Did you know this? There's a great,
I
great.
had no idea, but that's such a funny line going back.
It's unbelievable. There's an article in the LA Times that I cited in my, so there's an appendix in my Houston book about this, in which I made this prediction. I said, look at this. And then the guy around 2010, I think, had written this article in the LA Times where he tracked that down. It's fascinating. Why the world doesn't make more out of this, don't know.
I mean, I read your prediction saying that if Twitter doesn't change its length, it's going to go extinct. And you were right. Yes. They doubled up their characters.
That's it. Exactly. And because I'm not a communications theorist, no one would ever read my stuff and cite me, because this is the siloing of all this information. You learn,
which is a whole other problem.
Whole other topic. Exactly. But it's still this same sort of stuff. And the fact is that nothing that I do gets, I'm not even seen as a communications guy still. You get labeled for life. They say, oh, you're a scientist. Well, no, actually, I spent 25 years making films, and in the filmmaking, that gave me some insights on communication. Yeah, but you're still a scientist. That's what you got your PhD in. So you just learn to deal with that. We will be victorious on that front eventually. But that's what happened. And then, there's this great anecdote about Stephen Colbert got caught up in a joke that he told on his show, the Colbert Report, and his own people ended up tweeting about it. And when they tweeted, they left out the context. And it came across, when all you did was tell the punchline, it sounded like Colbert was a racist, and the whole Asian American community rose up and tried to get him canceled. And then eventually he had to address it on his show and slow everything down. He had the two co-creators of Twitter on the show. They talked about, we're starting to realize, this thing doesn't work so well at 140 characters. We may be changing that. And 2 years later, they did. They doubled it to 280 characters. That is narrative selection right there. They got selected. Either they were going to get selected into extinction, or they had to change. And they did. They doubled their character length. So you see those sorts of examples, and that's the selective pressure at work. And so getting back to what was our thread that we were talking about there.
We were talking about what does the ABT add in this new environment of media, and what I'm hearing you say is so basically we're in a completely new environment which selects for certain type of information. We have the decade of oh god, I forgot the name of, what are the stupid headlines that get you to read a stupid article? Clickbait. We're in the decade of clickbait. We're in the decade of everything's just about getting your attention for about 3 seconds until you realize that the site you clicked on isn't.
And by the way, the clickbait is just butt bombs.
Yeah, often.
It's something that goes against your whole context. You've already got the setup. You're used to all this stuff, and then here's something that's everything you thought about this person is wrong, basically. But everything you thought about this person is wrong. You click on that.
Yeah. So we have this changing environment, and in the end, what the ABT forces us to do is to get back to the whole story. It forces us to get back to
Yes. The ABT gives you the ideal form. That's what it's about. It's about the ideal form. And the ideal form consists of these 3 parts. And the ideal form has got a really good job with that first material. So we color code this in all the work that we do. And we refer to, so the first part, the and material, is color coded blue, because that's meant, blue is a soothing color. And it means that you begin your narrative not with explosions. You begin it with a gradual world that you can lead us into if you really want to communicate effectively. Then the butt bomb is red. That's all the energy, high energy stuff. That's the journey. And then the therefore is that's the actions, the solutions, and we color coded green. So we talk about the blue, the red, and the green material. And in the beginning, when we really started to intensify this course, at the start of the pandemic is when the Zoom world opened up, and it gave us a chance to start teaching this course through Zoom. And we broke it into a 1-month course, 10 1-hour sessions, fit within a month. And we've been doing it nonstop since then. So we're now on round 38 So that's 38 times we've iterated this course. And I don't know that anybody in the history of humanity has ever taken a communications intense thing like this and iterated it with about 25 people that are my group that work with me, that give guest lectures and things like that and listen in. And we have constant discussions after every session. Matt, my co-instructor, and I, every single session, we're on the phone talking for half an hour about what did we just do there. So it's been this rapid evolution thing. That's why I'm so excited about this new version of the book, is that it's got new things in there that haven't been in the model previously quite. And that's where we're seeing just how much chaos is going on. But as I say, one thing that's emerged is, in the beginning, we all agreed that there's three things there: the and, the but, and the therefore. And is, the and can get kind of boring, and like I'm talking about, not narrative, which means that we really think you should try and get to the but really quickly and then give us the therefore, because everybody wants to know what's the problem, what's the solution. Well, with time, with 3 years of doing this course over and over and over again, we've slowly begun to grasp this much deeper dimension, which is it's all about that blue material. It's all about the context. If you don't set up what you have to say the right way, if you don't have enough skill, thought, charisma, and everything else to set up the context of what the hell you're talking about, then all you're doing is just more of this grabbing eyeballs and exciting people and ending up with what Twitter does, which is turns into a pack of lemmings that are all bumping into each other, that have all been hypercharged through butt bombs. But nobody is up there setting out the context. This all leads back to why leadership is so important. And we're now, leadership's going extinct at the same time that we're losing the first act. And so we're turning into this kind of hysteria, butt bomb driven society of everybody, but this, but this, but this, but this. And that's really tough. And it means the better leaders of today have got a feel for that. They've got narrative intuition, and they know they've got to set up that context. And, I hate to flash back to that guy with the deep narrative intuition, but look at what his slogan was: Make America Great Again. That is pointing to the context that once upon a time we were this great and mighty society, but we've slipped in the world. Therefore, it's time to make America great again. Whether it's true or not, leave that up to the individuals. The point is that there is this structure, and it's very deep, and you can get into much more detail on it by reading the work of Joseph Campbell, and especially Christopher Vogler's book, The Writer's Journey. And that will take you into more detail than I can wade through. I mean, I've found Joseph Campbell's interviews with Bill Moyers to be boring. I can't really make it through his books. That's the problem with today's world. It needs the ABT. There isn't enough time to really wallow into this stuff at the intellectual level, but it's so important. Something needs to happen, because if it doesn't, again, look at these rotten movies coming out now. Over and over again. They don't have any first act. They have no depth, no meaning, no message, nothing. They're just entertainment park rides. On and on and on, including both of these big hits this summer, Barbie and Oppenheimer. Neither of them had a deep context. Oppenheimer came out, and within a week, it was out of the media. There were no major news pundits debating that movie back and forth, like, oh my God, what did it mean? There was a little bit of, wow, those were amazing visuals. And that's about it. And that's pretty sad, because once upon a time, movies did drive large scale thinking. But
and at the same time, we've lost that kind of communication with almost anything. Everything pops up and it disappears again. So
that's it.
And one of the things I'm realizing also when I'm listening is, so the Make America Great Again, the slogan, it's the therefore. But within that therefore, the but and the and are contained. There is the great again. It was great. Make it great,
good.
Meaning
Yeah,
we have to make it great.
Yes.
So
you're doing exactly what I did early on. Was I began to construct and realize, wait a second, this slogan is the therefore. And in fact, that's what powerful slogans are. They're a therefore. Every powerful slogan probably should be able to put the word therefore right before it, and it should make good sense. Therefore, Make America Great Again. A good slogan is meant to be aspirational and action oriented. And you're right. And so then you work backwards from that, and you see that is the therefore. And then you can construct the other two elements, which is once upon a time, we were a great and mighty nation, and we did this, and we did this, and we had all these, and that's where your whole setup, that's your first act. And everybody remember that world that we had? Remember all this stuff happened? In fact, you should watch the South Park episode.
Yeah, the member berries.
Member berries. There you go. Exactly. That's
remember
it.
Han Solo?
This this stuff just all cycles. The more you think about it, the more the pieces come. Oh my God, that was it. And of course, where did the ABT come from? It came from the South Park guys. Where did they get it from? They got it from Frank Danielle, the great screenwriting instructor at USC. So everybody should be clear about that, because some people say to me, oh, you're doing the South Park thing. Well, no, actually, they're doing the Frank Danielle thing. In the 1980s, Frank Danielle was a screenwriting instructor at USC, and he gave a speech in which he laid this out. He said, when we write first drafts, we fall into the dreaded and then structure. It is in the revisions that we begin to replace the and thens with buts and therefores, and those words give the texture to the story. And so then 2011, Comedy Central produced a documentary about the making of South Park, in which the two co-creators talked about. They said, we have this simple rule we use called the rule of replacing. We get a first draft of our script, we go back in and we replace ands with buts and therefores if it works. And then you look at that and you realize that came straight from Frank Danielle. Frank Danielle had a bunch of graduate students that spread around the country. And you know, actually, Frank Danielle was amazing. He was from Czechoslovakia and emigrated in the late 60s to Columbia University, set up the screenwriting program there, became the artistic director of the Sundance Institute, and eventually was the dean at USC Film School when I got there. And I was lucky enough to have his script analysis course in the year before he passed away. And he's the guy that spotted this dynamic. The crazy thing is he never mentioned it in our course, but it's right there in a speech in 1986. And so that is it, exactly. Memba berries. Why wouldn't the South Park guys know that? They understand this stuff very deeply. And one really cool little anecdote was that when I got done with the Houston book, a buddy of mine is friends with Matt Stone, one of the two co-creators of South Park, and he sent him my chapter where I credited them for, you know, it was through their documentary that I opened my eyes to these three words. And Matt wrote back this great email, which he said was okay to quote this one paragraph. And he said that Trey and I figured out early on that narrative structure is so important and so hard to get right. And that phrase there is what I use endlessly in our training, which is narrative structure is so important. And yet for some reason, he said the word so twice when he said about getting it, you know, right. He said, it's so important and it's so hard to get right. And that's it. Exactly. It's so hard. So it's the number one challenge in communication more than everything else. And why people teach these communication courses and don't spend 90% of their time on narrative structure, that's 90% of the challenge. Just getting the information put together in the right sequence so that people will understand the context, they will get charged up, and then they will go on a journey with you, and they will feel satisfaction when you solve that. And so they get it. And again, this is the first moment I've really even realized that, where I'm putting together a lot of things now about context, and especially this thing on Twitter 2 days ago, this crowdsourcing with the crowd now says this material is missing context. They use the word context right there in their error message. Go on Twitter right now and look at those things. You'll see that they're being called out. And so I guess what they're doing with Twitter now is if enough people complain about something, this is footage from 2 years ago that's being relabeled, then they will give them the crowdsourcing label of censoring it. So what they've done is they've shirked the blame for censoring from themselves and put it on the crowd. I'm figuring this out as we go along right now. It's only the last 2 days that I've seen this happening, but that's your deal, is that nobody wants to lead anymore. Everybody wants to crowdsource everything and put all the responsibility on committees. And then what do you expect?
So how about we close all of this down with exactly those words, and then what do you expect?
It's what do you expect? Exactly. That is therefore.
I might put it up as a podcast saying interview with a disgruntled old man.
There you go. What do you expect? Right. Final word.
If you do that, what do you expect?
What do you expect? Megan, you strip all your context off your narratives, and what do you expect? That's perfect.
Thank you very much, Randy.
And on that note, what do you expect? Bye-bye.